This episode of On the Bookshelf, featuring author Eric Jay Dolin, is sponsored by the Winthrop Book Depot and Cafe, located at 11 Somerset Avenue in Winthrop, Massachusetts. For most of us, our perception of pirates comes from meeting Captain Hook while reading Peter Pan, or the swashbuckling Errol Flynn, or even Johnny Depp in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. But author Eric Jay Dolin, with copious research, has created Black Flag's Blue Waters, the real story of the pirates that existed in the late 1600s and 1700s. Eric Jay Dolin reads an excerpt from his new book.
At the end of April 1726, Captain John Green was finally ready to leave. The last of the food, water, and supplies had been hoisted aboard the Elizabeth, which was tied to a wharf in Jamaica's capacious Kingston Harbor. Green and his 16-man crew were about to sail across the Atlantic to Africa's Guinea coast to pick up a cargo of slaves, the main labor source for the island's cruel economy. Jamaica's vast and lucrative sugar plantations brutally employed tens of thousands of slaves to do the backbreaking work of harvesting and processing sugarcane so that an ever-increasing number of people throughout the British Empire could sweeten their tea, coffee, and cakes. Most of these consumers blissfully unconcerned about the horrors perpetrated to delight their palate. The death rate was so high on these plantations that the owners needed to continually replenish their supply of slaves to keep up with the growing demand for sugar. Without the services of men like Green and his crew, Jamaica's economy would eventually grind to a halt. Not long after the Elizabeth departed from Jamaica's crystal blue waters, the trouble began. Captain Green and his first mate, Thomas Jenkins, quickly earned the enmity of the majority of the crew, who claimed that the two men had subjected them to bad usage and treated them barbarously, like dogs. The 27-year-old boatswain, William Fly, channeled this anger and began plotting a mutiny. In the dead of the night on May 27th, when the Elizabeth was hundreds of miles from the American coast, Fly and his co-conspirators decided it was time to strike. Just after 1 in the morning, Fly, who was standing watch, gave the signal. Tense with anticipation of the violence to come, he and 4 others strode across the main deck and approached Maurice Cundon, who was manning the helm. Fly leaned in close and whispered menacingly in Cundon's ear, "Damn you, if you stir a hand or foot or speak a word, I'll blow your brains out." To drive his threat home, Fly lifted his shirt to expose the gun tucked into his trousers. Petrified, Cundon watched as Fly climbed down the companionway to the captain's cabin below, with crewman Alexander Mitchell following closely behind. Violently rousing the startled Captain Green from his bed, the 2 mutineers hauled the struggling officer to the main deck. As they were about to pitch him into the sea, he screamed, "For God's sakes, boatswain, don't throw me overboard, for if you do, I shall go to hell." Relishing his new position of power, Fly coolly ordered the captain to repeat after him, "Lord, have mercy upon my soul." And then Fly, Mitchell, and a crewman named Winthrop threw Green over the rail. Reluctant to accept his fate, in a last-ditch effort, the struggling captain grabbed hold of the mainsheet with a vice-tight grip. It was, however, only a momentary reprieve. As Green dangled above the waves, Winthrop swung a cooper's broadaxe in a mighty arc, bringing it down on the hapless captain's wrist, severing his hand and launching him into the deep. Their bloodlust still raging, the mutineers now searched for their next victim, Jenkins. Quartermaster Samuel Cole yelled to the mate, "Come out of your cabin, you dog!" But Jenkins, who had heard Green struggling with his executioners just moments before, would not budge. Instead, he pleaded, "For the Lord's sake, save my life." The mutineers hauled Jenkins out to the main deck, where Winthrop shattered his shoulder with his now bloody broadaxe, shouting he should go after his commander, as he threw the first mate overboard. Bobbing in the water, Jenkins called out, "For God's sake, throw me a rope." But there would be no help. The mutineers controlled the vessel, rechristening it Fame's Revenge. Their reign as pirates had begun.
Eric Jay Dolin, thank you very much for sharing an excerpt from your very compelling 2018 book, Black Flags, Blue Waters. It's your 13th book. As you recall the process that brought this book together, would you say it was one of the more difficult books to put together or one of the easier ones? The research must have been really a challenge.
A lot of research went into it. It took me about 2 years. They're all about equally difficult because every single book I've written, save for one, has been about a topic I knew very little about. So it's essentially like getting a master's degree every 2 years. And it requires an immense amount of reading, a huge amount of synthesis of information, and then thousands of small and large decisions about what to include in the book and what not. I love the research part of it. I think I like researching it better than writing it, although it's a close second. But it is a very lengthy process. I'm right now in the midst of writing another book, this one on hurricanes, and I spent all today in front of a computer struggling with a part of a chapter to talk about the hurricane of 1926 in Miami. And it just brought back to me how difficult it is for me, and enjoyable once it's completed, to take a huge array of sources, in this case, letters, trial transcripts, local diaries, and newspaper accounts that are all coming at the same subject from a different angle, and taking all that information, synthesizing it, putting it together in a readable narrative format that keeps the reader wanting to flip to the next page. And sometimes it's very difficult cutting stuff that is compelling, but it just doesn't fit into my narrative.
There are probably as many stories about how one gets an inspiration to write a book as there are books. But in the case of this book, your inspiration was at home, wasn't it?
Yes. Most of the time I just go off and I do a bunch of reading and research, and I come up with a couple of ideas and I pitch them to my agent, and then we try to get my publisher engaged. For this book, I decided to do something a little bit different. I decided to pitch some ideas to my kids, Lily and Harry, who were then teenagers. And I went through a couple of ideas, and when I told them I was thinking about writing a book about pirates, their eyes lit up and they said, "That's it, Dad, you have to write about pirates." And I got really excited because even though I've written 13 books, neither of my kids have read any of them. So I figured this was going to be my big chance to get my kids to read my books, and I'm proud to report that my daughter Lily, who's a senior in college, has in fact read the book, and she said she enjoyed it. My son, who is a freshman in college, has only agreed to read it maybe by the time that he is 50. So I've been half successful.
Maybe your son's waiting for the movie.
Wait for the movie. That would be good.
If you'll allow me a brief digression, when I was preparing for this conversation, I discovered that you and I have a few things in common. We were both born in New York. We both grew up, you on Long Island, me in Westchester. You have a PhD from MIT. I was born in New York. Could we talk for a minute about your very interesting and exceptional education? You began doing your when you did your undergraduate work at Brown University,
right.
and I assume that because you grew up in coastal communities, the sea was very important to you.
Yeah, well, it starts a lot back before then. I have always loved the ocean. When I was a little kid, I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau when I grew up, and I actually was interested in pursuing marine biology. When I was in high school, I was a very serious shell collector. I even wrote a 150-page paper when I was a senior in high school on the mollusks of Long Island Sound, 2 chapters of which were published in a seashell magazine of professional malacologists. When I went to college, I thought I was going to be a marine biologist. I did get a biology degree, but I suddenly realized that I didn't like science as much as I thought I did. I liked reading about it. I didn't like going in the lab and doing the science, and calculus and chemistry were quite difficult for me. So I shifted to environmental policy, and then I decided I wanted to be a professor of environmental policy. So I went on to get a master's at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and a PhD at MIT. But then by the time I finished my PhD program, I had lost my interest to be a professor, mainly because while I enjoyed teaching, and I actually taught 2 classes, one at MIT and one at Northeastern, and I TA'd about 10 classes to pay for my education. I loved teaching. I did not like, or I knew that I wouldn't like doing the research that I would have to do to get tenure at a good university. It wasn't the kind of research and writing that I really liked. So I shifted again. I didn't apply for a single teaching job, and I worked in the environmental field for about 10 years, and then I discovered that what I really love is writing. So I tried to figure out a way to be a writer. I worked for a while for the National Transportation Safety Board writing accident reports. That was very unfulfilling. But my wife said, well, keep writing books, and by that point I had written 7 or 8, I guess 6 or 7 books, and she told me that if you put aside a year's worth of your salary, you can quit your job. And it took me another 5 years, and after I wrote Leviathan, the History of Whaling in America, I actually quit my job, and I've been a full-time writer for 11 years, and I couldn't have done it without the support of my wife and my family and a little bit of luck and good reviews, and my books have done fairly well. So far, so good.
You know, there's just one more thing we have in common, is that calculus thing.
I hated calculus.
The book really centers on what are the halcyon days of piracy in the late 1600s and the beginning 1700s. Could you give us a sense of what life was like in North America at that time?
Well, the colonies were quite small in the late 1600s and early 1700s. They were all hugging the coast, going from Charleston up to Boston and Newport. It was a hard-scrabble life. There were some wealthy merchants, but there were a lot of people that were just struggling to get by. Also, the colonies were, of course, not treated very well by the mother country, both in terms of being starved for currency and also not having the right to have representation in Parliament, which even back in the 1600s was a sore spot among, or sore point among the colonists. So that's in fact what led to the first sort of half of my book, which is when these Red Sea men would leave from the American colonies, pirates, that would go around the Cape of Good Hope, they would go into the Indian Ocean, and they would attack Mughal ships that were transiting between India and the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha, and then they would bring silver, gold, silk, other treasure, jewels, back to the colonies. And because the colonists felt that they were being treated rather shabbily by the mother country, they disregarded the crown and the parliament's entreaties to clamp down on these pirates, and instead they welcomed them with open arms, in large part because they were the fathers, sons, and brothers of the colonists themselves, and they were bringing things back to the colonies that the colonists really needed. But then we shift to after 1700 and after the War of the Spanish Succession, and the English government had been successful in clamping down on the Red Sea pirates, so pirates were no longer going to the Indian Ocean. Instead, in the 17 teens and 1720s, they were attacking merchant ships leaving from the colonies. So this was an entirely different situation. Whereas before, the colonists welcomed pirates because they were benefiting their bottom line, now the pirates were taking away from the colonists' bottom line by attacking commercial ships emanating from the colonies. So then the colonies found new bedfellows in the Crown and Parliament and helped sort of launch the final war against pirates, which ultimately drove them from the seas by the middle of the 1720s. So one of the things you really need to keep in mind whenever you are talking about pirates, or I would argue whenever you're talking about any historical issue, is you need to follow the money. And in this case, when you're benefiting from pirates, you love them. When they're attacking and plundering your ships, you hate them. And it's as simple and as difficult as that.
But this brings up something, if we might back up just a step, that really surprised me as I read your book, and that is the political implications of piracy, because there were commissions granted by governors to allow these pirates to actually flourish because they brought an improved economy into their colonies.
Right. Well, you have to understand that the colonial governors, especially in the 1600s, were often down on their luck aristocrats who the king placed in the governorships, and they viewed the colonies as their piggy bank. And they quickly realized that one of the ways in which they could earn money was by giving these fake privateering licenses to these Red Sea men who, instead of going out and attacking the French, which is what the privateering license said they were legally allowed to do, since this was during King William's War and France and England were at war, instead of doing that, they went into the Indian Ocean. But to get that fake privateering license, they would give a colonial government, say, 300 pounds or 300 pieces of eight. And then when they came back to the colonies, in order to get protection from those very same governors, they would have to give something that was called protection. And that was usually 100 pieces of eight per head. So some governors, such as Benjamin Fletcher of New York, earned a healthy sum, tens of thousands of pounds in kickbacks from these pirates. And it wasn't only the governors that were benefiting, it was the relatives of the pirates, but also many merchants in the colonies invested in pirate ventures. So when these pirates came back loaded with cash, the merchants benefited as well.
You made reference to the governor of New York. What made New York the epicenter of piracy at this time? Was it his allowing them to do what they did?
A part of it was New York was one of the largest ports in the colonies, centrally located. It wasn't the largest, Boston was. But really, I think it was in large part because of Benjamin Fletcher. He was an avaricious man. He was not well respected by many of his peers. He was down on his luck when he went to New York, and he did view piracy as a way to enhance his own riches, and he actively courted many pirates. So quickly the word got around that if you want to get a privateering license, a fake one, go to Governor Fletcher. He's the man to deal with.
Boston had its share of pirates, and they developed a relationship that allowed them to succeed and bring their riches here.
Oh, absolutely. In 1684, Governor Lynch of Jamaica argued that pirates had brought the equivalent of 80,000 pounds sterling into Boston alone. This at a time when a captain of a merchant ship would probably earn only 72 pounds sterling in a year. So 80,000 pounds is a lot of money. And another person at this very same time called Boston sort of the center for pirates from all nations. And there are many instances that I talk about in the book of pirates coming to Boston, being welcomed, because they were going to spend their money at local grog shops, and the governor might benefit a little bit, and also merchants as well. In fact, Samuel Shrimpton, who owned Noddle's Island, there was a pirate who came into Boston Harbor, and the customs collector from New York came all the way up to Boston to try to nab this pirate on behalf of the crown. But Shrimpton would have nothing to do with it. He was a powerful man, and he basically gave protection to this pirate and his men and threatened force if the customs officer or any of the local officials were to try to impede this pirate's activity. So it's a fascinating time in history.
Indeed. In your book, you talk about how these pirates were great fighters, they were great naval captains, and they had their share of military encounters. They sort of supplemented to take the enemy's ships out. We found that interesting.
Well, very few pirates attacked military ships by choice. There were many military and naval vessels that attacked pirates because they were trying to take them down. But maybe what you're referring to is there was a very famous pirate captain named Thomas Paine, who was in Newport, Rhode Island. He retired to Newport, Rhode Island. He married a woman who was the daughter of the future Supreme Court Justice of Newport, Rhode Island. He became a respectable fellow. He had a very well-known reputation as a fierce fighter in the Caribbean, both as a pirate and as a privateer. So during King William's War, when Newport was being threatened by multiple French privateers, who, if they were successful, might have burned Newport to the ground, Newport decided they needed to get a military force, a naval force, together to ward off these enemies. Who did they turn to lead that naval force? It was former pirate captain Thomas Paine. And he gathered together a fighting force of men and a couple of ships and went out there and actually scared the privateers off. So not only didn't they sack Newport, they were also heading towards New London at the time when he intercepted them. So that might have changed colonial history quite a bit if former pirate captain Thomas Paine hadn't been available to lead the charge.
Interesting that the pirates themselves were interesting men. You know, we think of fiction's perception of pirates as swashbucklers, but some of these men were family men who were trying to make enough to develop a retirement.
Oh, absolutely. Well, every pirate went into it thinking that they were going to make a killing, and whether it was a killing for them or their families, and many of them were married, and especially before 1700, a lot of the pirates came back and reintegrated with their families. They sent money back from Madagascar, which was the pirate hideout in the Indian Ocean. They sent love letters back and forth on ships that would arrive from the colonies and go back. So yes, many of them were family men, but again, you have to make a distinction between the pirates prior to 1700 that had ties to the cultures and communities from which they had come, and then the pirates of the 17-teens and the 1720s like Blackbeard and Stede Bonnet and the notorious Edward Lowe, some of whom had relationships before they went off to become pirates, but very few of them maintained any real relationship with people back on land because they were persona non grata. They couldn't just go into a port and buy goods, for example, or carouse in local grog shops. They had to go to pirate hideaways, and by the end of the 17-teens, there was only one of those left, which was Nassau in the Bahamas, and then that was sacked or taken over by Englishmen, and the pirates were run off. So really, from the late 17-teens to the mid-1720s, pirates were literally and figuratively on the run, on their ships, at sea, pulling in bays and harbors that were basically uninhabited. So they were really men on their own. They did not have much or anything in the way of family life to go back to.
In the early part of your book, you talk about how the pirates somehow facilitated slaves coming over to the colonies.
Right. Well, they not only facilitate, well, there are two things there. In Madagascar, there was a vibrant slave trade in Madagascar. There were a lot of pirates who hung out on St. Marie, which is a little island off of Madagascar. So a lot of New York merchants, as well as Boston merchants and others, got the idea that they would bring ships over there to supply the pirates with goods, all sorts of goods, sell stuff to them, and then while they were in Madagascar, they would trade for Madagascar slaves, which are cheaper than slaves that you can get from the west coast of Africa. And they would bring those back and sell them in the slave ports and slave marts of America. So pirates were tangentially involved in that. They were also more directly involved in slavery because a lot of pirates would plunder ships that sometimes had slaves on board. Now, some of those slaves were treated as slaves on board the pirate ship, and then they were resold at some later date. But a lot of black men and slaves that were captured by pirates were actually accepted into the pirate crew, and they became equal members, and they shared equally in all of the booty. So while some pirates definitely viewed black men as slaves and chattel to be sold, other pirates accepted them and treated them as equals, at least on board the ship.
Two of the pirates who we read about in popular literature were Blackbeard and Captain Kidd. But in your book, they're real people. Could you give us a sense of what these people were like?
Well, Blackbeard comes down to us in history as being the most fearsome of pirates, and he, according to one of his biographers, he had 14 wives and he prostituted one of them out to his men at times, and he ruled by fear. The interesting thing to me is that we know very little about Blackbeard's personality. He only lasted for about 2 years, and he wasn't really a very successful pirate, and he certainly wasn't as fierce as he's come down to us in the history books.
So how did he get his reputation?
Well, part of it was his name, and part of it was this book that was written in the 1720s, well after Blackbeard died, that sort of made him to be more than he was in reality. One of the great myths about Blackbeard is that he supposedly went into battle with matches tied to the end of his hair, lit so that his face would be wreathed in smoke, making him more fearsome than he actually was. That's total baloney, pure myth. So Blackbeard, I think, was interesting nonetheless, especially because he and about 400 of his men blockaded Charleston, South Carolina's harbor for the better part of a week and sent a shudder of fear throughout the entire colonies. And also his final denouement at the hands of British Naval Lieutenant Robert Maynard is quite dramatic when Maynard's men encountered Blackbeard off of Ocracoke Island in North Carolina, defeated them, killed Blackbeard, severed his head, and hung it from the bowsprit of a sloop. So that's a very memorable image that's come down to us in time. Captain Kidd was also not a very successful pirate. He only plundered a few ships, but he's really become famous to us because when he was being brought back in to face justice, rumors abounded that he had captured 500,000 pounds worth of treasure, sterling. The problem is he only turned over 14,000 pounds in the end, but so everybody thought, well, there's a huge gulf between 14,000 pounds and 500,000 pounds. He must have buried it somewhere along the way. So that's where the myth of buried treasure came from, and it's only morphed into something larger over time. And nobody has found any buried treasure of any pirate because no pirate from the Golden Age buried their treasure. Why would they? They don't know if they're going to be able to get back there to dig it up. Somebody else might show up and take it, and they often spent money as fast as they got it. So you have to parse out the myth from the reality. I happen to think the true story of pirates is more dramatic and exciting than the Hollywood version, but both can coexist. And I love going to the Pirates of the Caribbean movies and reading Treasure Island and watching the Goonies, or or even The Princess Bride with its repeated references to the dread pirate Roberts. But I think what I do in the book, which is of value, is I talk about the mythology, I talk about the reality, and I let the reader understand where the difference lays.
It's changed the perception, I'm sure, of a lot of readers of the mythical pirates and the real pirates that you bring to us.
I hope so.
You touched briefly on your next project. Could we elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, my next project should be of interest to people in Winthrop or on the water because it is a narrative history of hurricanes in America, starting with Christopher Columbus, going all the way up to the present. And if it doesn't kill me, trying to synthesize all of that information into a readable narrative book, I think it'll be a great one to read.
So Leviathan was a tremendous success, and I actually had read that some time ago. That's a wonderful book. As you continue to write these books, and again, the thread that binds them together, they all have something to do with the sea. Does it get easier? Does it get harder? Do you have a formula now, having cranked these up?
Yeah, more or less. I usually spend about 8 months doing just research and taking notes, and then I start writing, and then it's an iterative process back and forth, filling in holes. I don't know if it's gotten a lot easier. I think I've become a better writer. So that's good for the reader.
Sure.
And I think that I've learned some shortcuts, and I think that I'm a little bit better sort of separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. I'm a little bit better deciding more quickly what is valuable for my story and what can I leave aside. Because for any one of my books, I could have worked on them for 10 or 20 years and still found new material. But having a contract and having a deadline helps me focus. And so I think I've become better at making the needed decisions to produce a readable narrative history that doesn't put people to sleep.
And that's what Black Flags, Blue Waters, the 2018 book from the pen of Eric Jay Dolin is one of the beneficiaries of your hard work. Thank you for what you do, and
you're welcome.
Special thanks for joining us on this edition of On the Bookshelf.
Thank you very much.
I'm Pete Solomon. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you soon. This episode of On the Bookshelf, featuring author Eric Jay Dolin, is sponsored by the Winthrop Book Depot and Cafe, located at 11 Somerset Avenue in Winthrop, Massachusetts.